Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair and members of the Environment and Transportation Committee. For the record, I'm Delegate Michelle Guyton, District 42B in Baltimore County, and I'm going to sponsor responsibly. So I am going to present to you, and I ask for your consideration of House Bill 911. And what it does is suggest a solution for not one, not two, but many of the most pressing problems resulting from a severe shortage of licensed child care spots that we have in Maryland. Now, you have already heard Delegate Feldmark's testimony, and you have letters you should have letters from some of the same people in favor of this bill, but I'm not going to have you listen to all that again at this point. I will say just a few words. I think we all understand the importance of child care. We've lost 25% of our licensed child care spots since COVID in the state of Maryland, and I'm sorry, our licensed child care spots, and most of those are the family child care programs. You heard a lot about family child care programs earlier. Those are different than the traditional licensed settings that it can have many children. These are actually programs that are occurring in people's homes, and that's the main difference. And there are two sizes. Delegate Feldmark's bill, I believe, and I was following closely and I'm familiar with it, was referring to the larger family child care settings where you can have up to 12. My bill is referring to the small family child care settings, which you can have up to 8. But let me tell you what it does. So family child care programs, home-based programs, and the reason they're important is that they tend to have more flexible hours than all those centers, right? You can drop your child off from 8 to 5 in a center setting every day. But if you have to work shift work in particular, it is very, very difficult to find flexible child care for that. And this is where family child care programs really, really come in handy. Currently, family child care programs are only 1%. I'm sorry, the flexible family child care programs, those that serve those non-traditional hours, are only 1% of our current child care spots. So I want you to think about that. All right. The other reason it's important is that this is a viable business opportunity for women, and I will say particularly women of color, to actually start a small business in their home while raising their children and supporting other children at the same time. And then most of you are familiar with a report by our comptroller recently. The scarcity of childcare directly impacts the economic health of our state. And then finally, when you don't have licensed childcare in your area, particularly that's flexible for your needs, families tend to make do with unlicensed childcare, unregulated childcare, and childcare, honestly, that is often quite unsafe. And that's what these are the things that this bill is trying to address. So one of the primary barriers to starting licensed family childcare programs is that landlords, not always, but generally, prohibit it in rental properties. They're able to do so. House Bill 911 prohibits landlords from banning the operation of the smaller licensed family child care homes in their properties. The homes must be regulated and they must be licensed by the Maryland State Department of Education Office of Child Care. Delegate Healy asked the question earlier during Delegate Feldmark's bill, what does that include? And you have a letter of information, if not in front of you, then somewhere deep in those files, that actually lists the requirements for what you must have in your home to be licensed and regulated by the Office of Child Care. So not every property and not every person who wants to run a child care facility is going to qualify. In addition to that, landlords may collect an extra month of deposit. They must receive significant notice that the person wants to run a business on their property. And the renters must also provide certificates of insurance for the landlords so they can have a little bit more peace of mind. House Bill 911 does not limit, and this is the difference between this bill and the bill you heard earlier, one of the differences, does not limit zoning requirements. So these are two separate issues. If this bill is passed, landlords could not prohibit small family child care and rental properties unless zoning or common ownership rules prohibited it. That would still be possible under this bill. No, my preference would be to get rid of both of those provisions, but I'm not here to speak to hers. This is a main priority of the Women's Caucus, the women legislators of Maryland, something we've been working on for a while. And I request a favorable report on House Bill 911 because as the Maryland Child Care Association shared with us in their letter of support that you have, but also in their testimony today, any bias, and this is what we're talking about, bias related to childcare should be prohibited, and instead childcare businesses should be embraced as an important community support system and economic driver. So I do want to address the fact that you're going to hear a couple of favorable with amendment testimonies and one just straight unfavorable, to be expected in these sorts of conversations. I have discussed this bill with all of these folks and have had expressed my interest and my willingness to work with them to move forward in this space, at least take a small step in the right direction. So I may be willing, as Delegate Holmes and I discussed earlier today, we may be willing to consider their amendment depending on the will of the committee. So thank you very much. And I guess it's just me, so I will be happy to answer questions.
Any questions for the bill sponsor? Okay, thank you, Delegate Guyton. We will bring up our two in-person favorable amendment, Aoba and Ashley Clark. You sent the other guy up for the unfavorable. You're here for the favorable amendment?
That was strategic, Mr. Chair. No, don't worry. I'll be unfavorable shortly.
Good evening again, Chair Corman, Vice Chair Boyce, members of the committee. Again, Ashley Clark here for the record on behalf of the Maryland Multifamily Housing Association. So I do want to thank Delegate Guyton. We did have a conversation about this legislation. We appreciate her efforts in addressing a growing child care concern in Maryland. However, we do feel that multifamily dwellings are not the appropriate accommodations to resolve that concern. One of our predominant concerns would be over occupancy. Looking at the Maryland Education Code in 9.5-305, the adult to child ratio is 1 adult to every two children under the age of 2. And so prospectively, that could significantly increase the number of people occupying the unit beyond what's allowed by local occupancy standards. And so that presents not only a safety concern in the event of an emergency, but also a liability concern for any incidents that arise as a result of having child care homes on the landlord's property. Another concern would be noise complaints. Neighboring tenants, not the leasing centers, would likely express concerns over the noise that's emanating from those apartments, leaving leasing offices to field those complaints and respond to inquiries about the type of business that's occurring in those units, the reasons they weren't informed prior to move-in, and requests to transfer due to noise. Landlords will not be able to answer many of those questions as a matter of fair housing because familial status is a protected class. They also can't steer tenants who would like to have child care homes into certain units as a matter of fair housing. Lastly, the bill states that tenants must be named as a landlord, must name the landlord as an additional insured on the certificate of insurance, but that doesn't factor in the administrative burden of the landlord having to ensure that the policies don't lapse in coverage. It's silent as to the amount of coverage that would be provided, and it doesn't account for any additional insurance that the landlords may have to acquire because of the child care homes. It's asking for a favorable with amendment to remove multifamily. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Brian Anlew with the Apartment and Office Building Association. We are also favorable with amendments removing multifamily. While it's true that the bill does not preempt local zoning, the reason that we have local zoning and that they place restrictions on where you can have family child care center is because of compatibility. And I would submit to you all that in certain zones, if you notice my testimony refers to residential multifamily zones in Prince George's County, for example, the county has determined that it is not a compatible use, particularly in areas like our central business districts where you have high-rise multifamily buildings. One of the requirements that Prince Prince George's County has is that you have 75 square feet of outdoor space for a child to recreate in. And you just simply don't have that in some of these buildings. If you have a rooftop terrace with a pool and patio furniture, I think most people would agree that is not a suitable space for the child to recreate. And not only that, the local zoning code says you can't cross a major street to get to like a nearby park for the child care center. Beyond that, there's other restrictions that it's not at all clear to me who would be responsible for resolving. In Prince George's, if you do want to have a child care center in a residential multifamily zone, you could apply for what's called a special exception. That is a $2,500 fee. You have to do a community meeting, and you have to get county approval. Typically it's the property owner that applies for that special exception. So what would happen if the tenant wants to move forward with this, but the property owner does not? Would they be restricted from doing so under this bill? Would they have to pay the $2,500 special exception fee? What if in the community meeting the neighbors object to this use? What happens then? And so for those reasons, we respectfully urge that multifamily be exempted out from the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Vice Chair Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much. So let's say this bill passes and I'm in a facility that you're discussing. Wouldn't I still be subject to child care rules? So let's say I decide I want to do a child care in my second floor apartment and they come and check it. I'd probably be denied because it probably wouldn't be of size, it wouldn't have certain ADA accessibility, so on and so forth. So I would still be subject to the rules and the standards for child care for the state. Isn't that so?
Correct.
So I guess the next question would be, suppose I'm in an apartment building and I decide I have an agreement with my landlord that the community space, for instance, on the first floor is suitable to have, I don't know, before and after care that I can manage, and I have an MOU with the landlord to do so, and it meets the requirements of the state for child care. Would that be something that's acceptable?
Well, I guess one thing, and speaking with Delegate Guine, it appeared to me that she wanted to be able to have as many children that would be accommodated, and so that in that scenario, I feel like that would limit it to maybe one resident, and opposed to maybe more that are looking to do the same thing. And so I guess prospectively, it could be considered. But I think it would limit the intent of the bill, which is to have as many children.
And if I may, Vice Chair, I don't think there's anything presently in the law or in COMAR that would prevent that from happening. I think you could probably already, if you were a tenant, ask your landlord to enter into an MOU to do something like that. This bill just simply prohibits the landlord from imposing those restrictions.
Right. Thank you.
Delegate Lehman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry. It sounded to me like you were addressing a specific scenario in a specific county when you were talking about like a Board of Appeals situation. This is a statewide bill, is it not?
It is, but, and I didn't check, with apologies, Delegate, every single county in the state. AOBA only represents multifamily members in Montgomery and Prince George's, so I did check Montgomery and Prince George's, and I did find that Prince George's has special exception requirements. There could be other jurisdictions around the state that have similar local zoning ordinances that restrict where you can put a family daycare center.
So in my experience, counties deal with, zoning very differently. So sometimes it's like in Prince George's County Council sitting as the district council, but you have boards of zoning appeals and you have other, bodies, appointed bodies that deal with issues like this. So what can you say again, just briefly, what the gist of what your requested amendment would do?
Yeah, so we're just suggesting that multifamily specifically be taken out. We think that if the committee's will is to allow single-family rentals to be used as daycare and prohibit single-family landlords from banning the use of their property for daycare centers, we'd be supportive of that. But we just think that multifamily in particular is an incompatible use for a lot of the reasons we just stated.
So you're saying all multifamily, you're speaking to your membership in particular, so you're talking about apartments in particular?
Yes, I'm talking about apartment buildings specifically. I can't speak for, every type of landlord and every type of building, but for apartment buildings specifically, I do know, and I guess somewhat to your point, that there is a lot more flexibility in allowing daycare centers, say in commercial office buildings, for example. There's a lot of office buildings that have first floor daycare centers and that meet both local zoning and the state's requirements for family daycare centers.
You're probably correct, but I would just think that would create more obstacles to, in terms of access and affordability for somebody who would want to operate a daycare. I assume that's part of what Delegate Guyton is after. I've not discussed the bill with her, but the fact that there is such a shortage of daycare and that it is easier for, potential operators to provide it where they live. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I apologize, I missed the beginning of your testimony, so this may have already been covered, but I'm going to ask a couple things. One, from what you were saying, you focus on Prince George's County. Is this bill disproportionately affecting Prince George's County over the way things are done in other counties throughout the state?
No, I can't say that it is. All I'm suggesting, both in my written testimony and orally, is that we have local zoning codes because they determine compatibility. And while the bill does not preempt local zoning codes, the reason that the local authorities have determined that it's not a compatible use for multifamily zones is because there's a lot of barriers to putting a family daycare center in those buildings, the outdoor requirement being one of them, the size of the unit, as Ashley touched on.
If we're talking, are we talking about like daycare centers, or are we talking, there's also family daycare where people just take a small number of children into their home for the day?
And that's my apologies, Delegate. I'm sort of using the two terms interchangeably, but yes, I essentially mean family daycare center.
You're talking about
family
a
childcare
center where you.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, no, I specifically mean family childcare. What this bill is trying to address. The zoning codes don't quite make that distinction. They essentially call them daycare centers, or sometimes they're called family daycare, and that's why the two terms are sort of used interchangeably.
Okay,
but
so,
I'm
so
specifically,
what are you referring to? Are you referring to like somebody who takes a few children into his or her home to watch them during the day, or are you talking about an educational facility that would be covered, for example, by the 3-year-old program in the blueprint?
I'm talking about even in the first scenario, the person who takes 1 or 2 children into their home to be a licensed and registered family child care facility in Prince George's County, and also with some of the state requirements that the education article in Comar imposed, you do have to meet certain requirements.
Okay, so that's one question, and I'm not sure I agree with you about that. But the other question has to do with specifically Prince George's County, because as you know, all along the US 1 corridor, there are a lot of buildings, new apartment buildings being built as we speak, and a lot of them have various kinds of businesses, retail, and so forth on the first floor and of those buildings. And so it's a mixed use area anyway. Is that what you're talking about, or are you talking about like an old fashioned apartment building?
No, so again, and I think this goes to the Vice Chair's question about the use of, say, a common area, or perhaps in one of these mixed-use buildings, the use of like a retail component of a building that meets both the local zoning code and the state's requirements for a family child care facility. But that's not what is specifically contemplated by this bill. It suggests that the unit, the residential component, that be allowed to be used as a family child care facility. And what I'm suggesting is that the unit itself is it's an incompatible use. Now, if there are other pieces of the property, because it's mixed use or because it's, whatever have you in that development, that make, say, the commercial space within the zoning code allowable for family child care or a daycare, if you will, then that would still be okay. But I mean, we're referring to specifically the use of a unit for a family child care facility.
If I live in a house and I can do this, you don't want me to be able to do this if I live in an apartment building. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that in a residential apartment building, strictly residential or strictly the residential component of an apartment building, it could potentially be an incompatible use. There are other parts of a building or property that may be more compatible, but it's not a compatible use in a.
Thank you for sharing your information. Appreciate it.
Delegate Addison.
Hello. So as a former child care provider, what I know is that we can, under Maryland State Department of Education, who took over child care licensing, if you come into a house, apartment house or whatever, if you have the amount of space, you can use that as a family child care space. However, if you go downstairs, you can use that as a part of a play area, as long as you can walk and have distances where you can walk so that the children can be able to play. So I don't know about the apartment size, because you can be licensed in apartments for the family child care use.
And thank you, Delegate Addison. I think what we're trying to convey is we're not saying that legally it cannot be done. You know, like if you are able to go through the proper channels to get it done. I think what we're trying to express is that there are issues if you are in multifamily housing, such as the over-occupancy that I discussed as a safety concern, or the noise that a neighbor, someone may have a very high sensitivity to noise, or might not be as tolerant of children running over their heads. And those are things that the landlord's going to have to field those questions. But they would also be limited, and that's why I was referencing fair housing, because familial status, anyone in your apartment under the age of 18, you can't really discuss what's going on in that unit. And then I also can't steer someone who does want to have a child care home into, oh, well, do you mind moving into a ground floor apartment? Because that's also a violation of fair housing. So those are just some of the concerns we were saying that would be a hurdle for us in being okay with having child care homes in the individual units.
Okay. Just trying to make it clear, because Comar says that you can have them. Oh, I'm sorry. Because according to Comar, I know that they do allow you to have it in apartment buildings, whether you're on the top or on the bottom floor.
Right.
Okay.
Understood.
Okay, thank you. We'll turn to our unfavorable, Bill Costelli on behalf of the Realtors.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill Castelli on behalf of the Maryland Realtors, and we appreciate our conversation with Delegate Guyton on the bill. We are opposed, though. A couple of the concerns that we have is that when you're renting out residential property, right now you typically will have insurance on that property. That property insurance will typically preclude you having a commercial activity. So under this bill, while it does talk about you having to be additionally insured and added, that typically would be to the liability insurance that the child care provider would have. But it doesn't talk to the property insurance that's on the home itself. So that would also have to be addressed. But generally speaking, I would just say that, we think that this is a conversation a tenant should have with a landlord, and there should be agreement between the parties about whether they're going to be conducting, a commercial business in the property. And, those are our major concerns with the bill.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, that concludes the bill here on House Bill 911.